Hey, everybody, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us for another Sunday Q&A. I know we took a break a week ago to give everybody a Sunday off for the holiday, but we are back tonight, and I am thrilled to have with us Senator Jennifer McClellan, who is one of our fantastic candidates running for governor. Senator, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, Sally. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm very happy to be here. I am so looking forward to this conversation, and I'm so glad to have so many folks tuning in from Charlottesville and around Virginia to talk with us. I know that you know Charlottesville well as a UVA alum. So for some of the folks who are with us, I'm sure that you are no stranger. For those who haven't had a chance to meet Senator McClellan, I'm sure that you will quickly come to understand why I have considered her to be such a fantastic mentor in my short time in the House. She knows exactly what it's like to be a 32-year-old female delegate in a very strange environment, but she was there when there were even fewer friends. I know that every time we have a chance to talk, I learn so much, both about history of Virginia, but especially about the history of the body in which we serve and how that shapes the work that we do today. So we will get right into it and start to have a chance for you to introduce yourself to the folks who are watching. If you are tuning in, there are two places to watch us, both YouTube and Facebook. And on both of those streams, you can drop a question in the chat if you have something that you would like to hear from our guest tonight. I'll ask a few questions just to get us going so that we can learn a little bit more about the senator. But we will start to integrate that as you go. So please, as questions occur to you, drop them in the chat and we will make sure to mind them. Let me just say before we get going that we are so fortunate to have a public servant of your caliber, not just serving in the Senate, but running now for governor. There are so many reasons why, and I'm sure that everyone who's watching will have a chance to see them. But one that I think I want to highlight in particular is that so much has changed in Richmond in the last couple years since this new wave of folks helped us take on the majority. And it's a very different place than it was when you started your service 15 years ago. And I think that now, in a time when so many new projects are possible, and especially in a district like ours that is so eager to always be pushing the pace of progressive change, that we can always be eager to go further and faster, and all of that is great. And if you are proud of a lot of the change that you've seen coming out of Richmond in the last couple of years, I hope you will come to see that Senator McClellan's fingerprints are on all of it. And so not just, when her name is on top of the bill, but in, little small ways and holding together all of those big projects. She really is a pillar of the institution. And so I'm excited to have her join us here tonight and to share her story with you. So Senator, let me hand it off to you and ask you to tell us a little bit about how you came to public service. How did you find yourself in the House now 15 years ago?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sally, for having me. And it has been a pleasure getting to know you. And if I have been able to help you in your journey, that means a lot to me because you're right. When I came in 15 years ago, I was the youngest African-American woman from the most Democratic district in the state, in a body that was mostly white men over 50. And more moderate. So we've come a long way, and I'm so glad to have you there. My public service journey started when I was a kid, listening to my parents tell stories of their lives growing up in the segregated South during the Depression, living through Jim Crow, living through the New Deal. And the more I learned about their lives and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, my own love of history, because I'm a huge history nerd, I came to understand that at its best, government is a force for solving problems, for helping make people's lives better, for progressive change. At its worst, it's a force for oppressing some for the benefit of others. And what really tipped the scale for me, to show you how much of a nerd I am, is watching a miniseries about John F. Kennedy when I was 11. And after watching that, I said, you know what? I want to be a part of government. At 11, I didn't know what that meant. When I went to college, I joined the Young Democrats and started organizing students at the University of Richmond. I went to law school at UVA. My dream was to be counsel to the Senate Judiciary, which one of my political heroes, Robert Kennedy, that's how he got his start, But when I was in law school, Republicans took over Congress and I didn't want to work for them. So I kept organizing young people all across Virginia as president of the state Young Democrats my entire time at UVA. So while other students played softball and in their spare time, I was doing campaign invasions all over the Commonwealth. And I really thought that most of my time in politics was just going to be as a volunteer. And when my delegate, Viola Baskerville, ran for lieutenant governor in 2005, a lot of friends started saying, like, you should think about running for her seat. And the more I thought about it, I was like, you know what? I want to be the one making the change, not just electing other people to do it. So I thought, I'm as ready as I'm ever going to be. At that point, I had spent 15 years as a community service organizer and a community organizer, both in the party and in my community. And so I ran and I won, and I've loved every minute of it.
Every minute?
Most minutes. Even the tough times, they're less, they're always lessons in failure, or lessons in heartache. So while you may not enjoy it in the moment, you learn from it and it makes you better.
It's very well said. There are definitely some difficult moments in public service, but the work of the victories that we do secure are pretty special, and it's a real honor to do it. I know, as you say, I was teasing you a little about loving every minute, because when you first got to the House, it was a very different place. Right now, our caucus on the Democratic side is almost half women, and we are Democrats in the majority. When you got there, Democrats were in the extreme minority. Barely a third of the chamber was Democrats. And as you said, you were a young African-American woman, and yet, despite being disempowered in terms of numbers, you quickly developed a reputation for being a very effective legislator. How did you do it in that really difficult environment?
I made a decision early on. I knew that I could either be an effective legislator or I could be a partisan bomb thrower, but I couldn't be both. And I, at my core, am a problem solver. When I see a problem, I rush to fix it. When I see people in pain, I rush to ease their suffering. And so I knew that to get anything done, I would have to do a couple things. One, I'd have to understand perspective. Everyone in that building, their political views, their policy views are shaped by their own life experiences. And so if I'm going to get them to understand my perspective or move them to where I want them to be, I need to understand theirs. I may not agree with it, but I need to understand it. When you do that, you can find common ground and you start from there. And you push as far as you can go. And you keep pushing, but you have to do it from a place of respect and meeting people where they are. And I also knew, this is just part of it is my personality. I'm the youngest child of older parents who were pretty old school. And so I spent a lot of time listening before I talked. And when you do that and you listen empathetically, and you show respect to other people, then they will show respect to you. So that's how I've been able to do it. But sometimes, I remember a couple of times where, being a young woman there was very interesting. Hopefully you haven't seen some of these things. I remember once I was called the Barbie of the House of Delegates. And that person meant it as a compliment. And, you just kind of, you just keep pushing through those moments too.
I was testifying in front of the Senate Commerce Committee last week, and one of your esteemed colleagues, who shall remain nameless, chose to call me the young lady from Charlottesville. And I was steaming a little bit in the moment. And then a mutual friend of ours texted me and said, "Don't worry, they call Jen that, and she's a senior senator from Richmond."
That's, yeah. Well, this is not a secret because it happened on the Senate floor, but Senator Bill DeSteph referred to me as young lady, and
It used to be the custom and practice in the House, and up until a couple years ago, that you would refer to the men as gentlemen and the women as gentle ladies. And I'm glad that they've retired that, because in my experience, if you're a woman who makes her way into the House, there is usually precious little gentle about you. So I'm glad that is something that now we just call everybody delegate, which as we should. So, a lot has changed since then. You served in the minority for many, many years. But in the last 2 years, we have had this tremendous blue wave. And now we find ourselves with a Democratic trifecta in Richmond. And so much that was impossible until we did that is now possible. And you have been able to secure many victories that have only been dreams for a long time in Virginia. Can you talk about some of the projects that you're most proud of that we've accomplished in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think I was trying to pick one, and that's hard. But
it is, especially for you.
Yeah. I think the two I'm the proudest of, one is the Virginia Clean Economy Act, because it really was, when the bill passed, I wanted to jump up on the Senate floor and just shout, "The eagle has landed," because it was that big a deal that we transformed our energy policy to a clean energy policy. And it was transformative change for Virginia. And the fact that we did it in one session, and at so many places along the way, that bill almost died. That it was just a matter of pulling everybody together, keeping everybody together, and just pushing through, and keeping our eye on the end goal. And so that one I'm very proud of, because it wasn't just about me. It was a huge team effort that involved a coalition of environmental groups, clean energy folks, public health experts, many advocates, many legislators, and many hours of work. So I think that one I'm very proud of. The second one is the Reproductive Health Protection Act. I was the first member of the House of Delegates to be pregnant while in office in 2010. And I remember, before, I was in my first trimester, so it wasn't public yet, but I remember that was the first year that the mandatory ultrasound bill made it to the floor. And before it made it to the floor, when I had my own ultrasound and I was talking to my doctor about that bill and learning about how abortion laws impact the doctor-patient relationship in a way I had never thought of before. And I stood up on the House floor and spoke against that bill, and we were able to kill it that year, but 2 years later it passed. And so now to be the one carrying the first bill, the bill that made Virginia the first state in the South to proactively protect access to reproductive health by repealing 4 barriers, including that one, again, just shows that if you're persistent and you don't take the loss, you just keep pushing until you get the victory. I'm very proud of that one.
As you should be. And we have had the pleasure of working together this year on building on that work for reproductive justice here in Virginia, and carrying together legislation to remove another long overdue law on the books, which was the ban on abortion care coverage on our state exchange. I can understand why it's difficult for you to pick the projects you're most proud of, because so many of them bear your work. I know the state exchange that we are now going to be moving forward in Virginia, which would be the backbone of most major healthcare reform, any kind of public option we might pursue. That was work that you led. The Clean Economy Act, which has put us as the first Southern state on a path to a carbon-free economy, is enormous work. I should say that when you say that bill almost died several times, I know that some of us in the House were sometimes the difficult people holding up that process. You really were the person holding it all together, because you are such a trusted leader in both chambers. I know that the House, especially some of the younger members, always want to go further and faster, especially those of us serving in districts like this one. And I think it's a testament to the respect and trust that you've built, that you could say to some of us who really were stretching that coalition to as far as it could go, to tell us, okay, it's time to stop now, that this is all that we can get this time without breaking this very fragile deal. I think sometimes when folks look at at these big bundles that come out of Richmond, they assume that they were a certainty from the start. And I think sometimes they don't appreciate just how fragile they are at so many moments. And it has meant so much to me to have someone I could trust in the Senate to say that this is as much we can get for now, but we will come back for the rest.
And you know, and and sometimes that's a hard line to see. And for me, the touchstone always is this better than status quo? And if so, let's take it and then keep pushing. Because, you know, we weren't talking, if that bill failed, we weren't talking about, well, next year we can come back and get something better. It really was going to be probably a 4-year difference, because that bill barely got out of the Senate as it was, and we weren't sure we could get it out again anytime soon. So, but that's always the touchstone. Is this better than status quo? And if so, take that win and keep pushing.
As you think about the places where we need to push most, you know, we have a lot to be proud of that we've done in the last couple of years, but there's still a lot of really important work to do. As you look ahead, you know, where do you feel like we're falling short most right now? Where are you most invested in really pushing how we see things in Richmond?
I think our education system. And when I say education, I think of from birth to career. And in most people think about K-12. In K-12, we have inequity baked into the system that we need to address. And that means the state doing more of its share to invest and not just leaving it to localities to bear the brunt of funding our K-12 system. But the equity gap begins at birth. And you can tell on day one, you know, when my son started kindergarten and I asked his teacher what's changed in the 20 years, she said how kindergarten used to be where you learn the soft skills. Now kindergarten's all academic, and she can tell on day one which one of her students got a formal early childhood education and which one didn't. But too many people think of early childhood as babysitting. It's like, no. That is part of our education system. And if we get that right, if we truly transform our education system from early childhood to career, that lays the foundation for economic opportunity for everybody. That lays the foundation for health, safe, thriving communities. And as we've seen in the past 4 years, it's critical to healthy, thriving democracy. So I think that's the place we really have a lot of work to do. But I also think our economy doesn't center people, but people are the backbone of our economy. And there's so many ways where we are not giving our workforce the tools, the resources, the benefits they need to thrive. That's everything from, you know, who is excluded from minimum wage to who has access to anti-discrimination laws, who has family, you know, do we have family-friendly policies that recognize that workers are also people who will be more productive if they can take care of their health needs or their family needs. So I think those are the two areas where we still have so much work to do.
I think that's spot on. I was on the phone with one of our county board members this morning talking about when is Richmond going to pick up its fair share of the education system. And I think that, you know, that's the system that we already have. But as you say, there are so many parts of that pipeline from birth to career in education where we aren't yet really up to snuff. I can't help but notice that I have to think that that's partly a lens that a lot of women in public service bring to it. That, you know, childcare is not just babysitting, that is serious professional work. And that family life and work life are not currently sustainable for so many people, but especially women who are doing double duty when they get home as well. And I think that that's a solid segue to ask you, you know, why did you choose to take this next step to run for governor? In part because you are running to be the first female governor of Virginia. And I have to think that you would bring that lens to a lot of things. What made you decide to take this step from this long track record of service that you have in the General Assembly to higher office?
Well, as much as I love being in the legislature, at the end of the day, the governor sets the agenda. through the budget, through the appointments. When the governor makes something a priority, is much more likely to happen. And before COVID, I was frustrated at how we weren't really fully funding our education system in an equitable way. There were too many communities in Virginia that were being left behind, and too many people whose experiences weren't being centered as we tried to craft solutions to their problems. COVID made that worse. COVID has laid bare inequities that many of us already knew were there and we're working to try to eradicate. And now we need to rebuild our economy, our healthcare and economic safety nets, our education system in a way that addresses that inequity. And frankly, in a way that addresses a growing lack of faith that I see among a lot of people in government's ability to understand, let alone solve their problems. And so I think Virginia needs a new perspective, a new generation of leadership, but someone with the experience and the knowledge and the record of coalition building to get that done.
Yeah, I think that that's spot on. And one of the things that I have always appreciated about you as a mentor and a colleague is that when you say that you're going to put education first, you're serious about the scale of the problem. I know a lot of people are talking about, oh, well, we're going to take next steps with our education system by legalizing pot, and we're going to make a few $100 million there, and we'll pour that into our schools, and that'll solve everything. I have appreciated the depth and the rigor that you have brought to the plans that you have for addressing educational inequity. Can you talk a little about those? I know there's a lot to it, both the work on our K-12 system, but also a really sizable plan that you have put out on childcare.
Yeah, so my childcare plan, it's a universal childcare plan that would ensure that no family pays more than 7% of their income on childcare. And I use childcare and early childhood education interchangeably. We also have to invest in building out the childcare industry that's been decimated by COVID and investing in the workforce to provide the quality that we need. On K-12, fully funding the Board of Education's recommended standards of quality, including the equity fund, is the first step. But we need to completely restructure how we fund K-12 education. The local composite index is just not working. And so I will put together a plan to completely restructure how we fund education sort of in the second part of my term. And then reimagining the curriculum. We did a high school redesign where we had the Board of Education come up with the profile of a 21st century graduate and then redesign high school to produce that student. We've got to update that profile because technology and a lot of things through COVID have changed what we need. So we got to update it, but then we need to rebuild and redesign early childhood through probably, I'd say, year 14, and then redesign the educator pipeline to produce the teachers and the workforce to produce the students that meet that profile. So that, in a nutshell, is my education proposal. You can find more details on my website. We've rolled out the early childhood piece. We'll be rolling out the rest in the weeks to come.
Yeah, and it's going to take a lot of serious thought and resources. There are a lot of people who like to say that Virginia has some of the best public schools in the country, and that is true. We have some of the best public schools in the country, but I think both of us believe that our mission is not complete until every child has access to serious education. Can you talk about in particular? We have a question here from someone in the chat, from Nikita, who wants to know about how we address particularly that gap, that extreme inequality we have between some of our highest performing schools and some of our lowest performing ones. There are some people who would like to see us just move kids around and say, oh, well, let's send more kids to the higher performing schools. Let's open more choice into the system and just get kids out of those lower performing schools. And you said, I think Nikita's had a chance to hear you talk before, that you would rather focus on fixing the underperforming schools. What does that mean concretely?
So first we need to, it's not a one size fits all fix. And it's important to understand that we have got to dig into those schools to figure out what's going on. For some of it, it is a lack of resources. For some of it, it's because they have high concentration of kids in poverty who face trauma every day at home. Some of it is the lack of support personnel to meet the kids' needs. So making sure we know in each school what is the root problem here, and then give them the resources they need to fix that root problem. We've also got to recognize there is an equity within school buildings for that very reason. That's why when the Board of Education recommends new standards of quality, that includes support personnel, that includes social workers, it includes mental health professionals, nurses, because it's not just the teachers and the curriculum that impacts whether a student is learning, but the support services that student has. Do they have access to technology, access to broadband? Do they have, are we paying their teachers what they're worth? Are we retaining teachers? Are we getting, enough teachers in the pipeline? So it's making sure we understand there's not a one size fits all approach, but we cannot build enough new charter schools to address inequity. And the more we try to focus on, well, let's just build something new and move people around, you're always going to leave somebody behind. You're always going to leave somebody behind when you do that.
Yeah, I do think that we really have to come to grips with just how far behind we are in Virginia. As you said, our teacher pay is nowhere near high enough. We are literally last in the nation for relative teacher pay, how much we pay our teachers compared to how expensive it is to live in Virginia. And so there's a lot to do. One thing that you touched on, which I think is a good segue to a question we had here, is about the trauma that so many children in our highest need schools experience. And you have done a lot of work at the intersection between education and then also our criminal system about students who are forced onto the margins and often out of our education pipeline entirely and into the courts and into the jails and prisons because we do have so many really draconian criminal laws here in Virginia. Can you talk about your work on youth and criminal justice and all that, where those two issues come together?
Yeah, first I want to shout out Legal Aid Justice Center, because this has really been a partnership with them for a very, very long time. They brought to me, I don't know, maybe 2012, anecdotally, stories of students who were being expelled, long-term suspended, or referred to law enforcement that was disproportionately impacting students of color and students with disabilities. 1 in 5 kids have some either intellectual or developmental disability or the beginnings of a mental illness that begins to manifest in behavior. And they were being suspended, expelled, or in a lot of cases charged with disorderly conduct for underlying behavior that was a signal they needed services. So first, we put in a bill in 2012 to quantify what we suspected. And that requires school divisions to report their discipline data by demographics. With that data, Legal Aid Justice Center was able to issue their annual reports showing the numbers. And once we did that, we could make the case to the policymakers, we are pushing out a generation of students. And in some cases, criminalizing childhood. And we were able then to reform some of our discipline laws by limiting the number of days you could be suspended long-term, limiting the age by which you could suspend children, because we were having like preschool kids were being suspended. And then last year, eliminating disorderly conduct for behavior at a school or school-sponsored event. And those 3 changes, I think, dramatically paused the school to prison pipeline. We still have a lot of work to do to make sure we are getting the mental health professionals in our buildings, because when we balanced the budget in the last recession, we put a cap on the number of support personnel that the state would fund. That meant you saw a lot of those professionals and social workers weren't funded. This year, I have a bill. It started out as a bill with La Cherise Ayer to fully fund the SOQs. We couldn't get the money for that. So what we did do was now change the ratio for certain support personnel. Now every school division will have to have at least 3 of either a nurse, a social worker, or one of the mental health professionals, and then the state will fund its share of that, because all of the school divisions were telling us that's the highest priority right now are the nurses, the mental health professionals, and the social workers. So getting them back in the building is going to be a big step in addressing that problem.
They were short-staffed before COVID, but especially now as our kids get back in those buildings, their work will be absolutely essential. Let me add my thanks to the Legal Aid Justice Center. They are behind the scenes and out in front in the trenches on a lot of the work that I do and the work that we do together. They really do augment so much of the good work we're able to do in Richmond. I know that you have another bill that you're carrying this session at the intersection of mental health and justice. And we have a question here from Richard in the chat who wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the status of that bill and how you think it's going to come together. It seems like a high priority for him.
Yeah, so this bill again has a Charlottesville connection. This bill is designed to provide accommodations in the criminal justice system for individuals with intellectual, developmental disabilities, autism, or mental health issues. Right now, there's very little training on those conditions for lawyers and judges. There is no ability to provide evidence of those conditions in your trial. There's no ability for the judge to consider them for bail or sentencing determination. So this bill would change all of that. There is universal consensus around the intellectual and developmental disability and the autism piece. What seems to be the sticking point is mental illness. How do we define mental illness? And the sense that if someone is found not guilty because they don't have the intent necessary, for an element of a crime because of their mental illness, there's some sense that they need to somehow be forced into services. To me, that's not the right frame. If they don't have the ability to form the intent of a crime, they shouldn't be convicted of it. And their access to treatment for their illness should not be dependent on whether they're convicted of a crime. And so I'm hopeful that the bill's going to go into conference. I am hopeful we are able to reach an agreement on the mental health piece, providing evidence of the mental illness piece. The rest of the bill is fine, but that seems to be the sticking point, is allowing evidence of mental illness to prove whether somebody had the requisite intent.
It was a challenge that I encountered in some of the bill that I was carrying this session as well. There are so many people who want to rely on our prisons and jails as the sole form of treatment. And I was carrying bills on reducing felony penalties for drug possession and was told over and over again, well, we have to get them in jail because that's where they'll get treatment, which is such a backward way of thinking about serving anyone well. We had a question here from Anna in the chat about what we can do better. Separate from keeping people out of incarceration, what does it mean to serve Virginians suffering from serious mental illness well? I know it's something that we in the Charlottesville community think a lot about, thanks to the leadership from Senator Deeds, who has been a statewide leader in mental health. As everybody here knows, he runs the Deeds Commission, which is what everybody but him calls it. And I know that you have been a partner to him in that work as well. What does it look like to do better by Virginians with mental illness?
I think recognizing that mental health shouldn't be thought of separately from overall health, and that we are investing in our mental health system and our mental health safety nets just as much as we are in our overall healthcare system and healthcare safety nets. To nerd out for a minute, I wrote an academic journal article all about the history of mental health public policy in Virginia. And from the beginning, it has always been reactive and not proactive. I mean, Virginia was the first, when we were a colony, we created the first public hospital for mental health. That's the good news. The bad news, I mean, not only was it based on sort of old notions of science, which now most people would agree were horrible, but it was in reaction to a tragedy. There was a study, a flurry of activity, a law passed, and then everybody ignored it. And then there was another tragedy, a flurry of activity, a study, a flurry of legislation, and then everybody ignored it. And it's this ongoing cycle. And when Virginia Tech happened, we made a lot of investments in our community-based mental health system. And then over time with the recession, we disinvested, and it led to tragedy again. We have got to consistently invest in the community-based services to meet the healthcare needs, the mental health care needs of Virginians. If 1 in 5 Virginians has some mental health condition, why are we segmenting mental health from overall health? It makes no sense.
I hope those of you who are watching can see why we all so fondly refer to the senator as a huge history nerd, because that's always where she starts with anything. But it's critical context. And I think that especially now amid the COVID fallout, this is one more chance for us not to repeat that mistake, because I think we know that in any recession, in any major economic crisis, there's going to be serious mental health consequences, but especially in this one that has been marked so much by social isolation, especially for children, especially for the elderly, that this is going to be a time where we're going to need an even more robust mental health system than we had, and understanding and not repeating that problem of having something go to a study and then come back and not be acted on. It also reminds me of something you were saying earlier about your strategy for tackling the challenges in our school to prison pipeline in partnership with the Legal Aid Justice Center, which is, how do you do study bills right? How do you actually set up a real strategy to get the information that you need to make the case that a policy needs to be passed? And that is something that I have seen you do over and over again, to not just have a study sit on the shelf, but actually use it to convert into impactful policy. And I think one of the most recent examples of that, for which you deserve tremendous credit, is our work on cannabis reform in Virginia. Because last year you were central to our work on decriminalization, and then also launching the study that has now teed up a lot of our work on legalization. Can you talk about both how that work came to be, and then what you're hoping to get out of this legalization bill that we're considering in our current session?
Yeah, so last year it was very clear that we had the votes for decriminalization, but we didn't have the votes for legalization. And it also was clear that some states have legalized right, and some wrong. And to me, right means, are you addressing the social impacts of prohibition? Everybody knows that it is predominantly people of color who've been disproportionately arrested, and their communities disproportionately impacted by those arrests and by prohibition. So how do you legalize in a way that those communities have an opportunity to participate in the new business? And how do you expunge the records of people who were incarcerated and still are being punished for what now is going to be legal? And so we put the study in asking, look at what the other states have done, but make recommendations on 5 core principles. How do we do it in a way that addresses that inequity? How do we do it in a way that preserves public health, particularly for minors? How do we do it in a way that ensures that that we do this right? And that study, we had JLARC do it because we knew they would do it right. And the one thing I regret is we had them issue the study in November. And unfortunately, due to COVID and special session and everything, I think we didn't really have a lot of time between when that report came out and when we had to start filing bills. And so I don't know if we will get, there's a delayed enactment in the bill where the bill is now, a fully regulated legal market won't happen for 3 or 4 years. And we need the time to build it and get that right. But what we are pushing for is for simple possession to be legalized now, because decrim alone does not end the disproportionate impact on people of color. I think data just came out the other day. I saw an article that it is, even though it's now a $25 fine, it is still predominantly people of color that are getting charged. And I want to be sure that any legalized market is not dominated by large, predominantly white-owned businesses, that everyone has an opportunity to benefit from this new legal market, and that we are starting to undo the damage that prohibition had on our communities of color.
It's going to take a lot of work for us to do this right. I mean, I know that our emails and phones are flooded every day with people saying, I want you to legalize cannabis. And we can say, yes, I support that too. But there's a lot of steps to do it right. And I have appreciated you being one of the very loud voices for saying at a bare minimum, we have to stop the harm now. One of the most straightforward things that we can do is eliminate the civil penalty for simple possession of cannabis right away. Because as you said, we already have data from the first few months of that civil penalty from last June. And I think it's something like 4 times as much. Black Virginians are 4 times as likely to be hit with that civil penalty. So moving from jail time to a fine hasn't really changed the racism in the system. And so at the very least, we can stop that now. It takes a lot longer to build up a robust market and to make sure, in particular, we build the structures that will protect space for those smaller entrepreneurs, particularly in the communities and the specific people who have been impacted by the war on drugs. Because if we just open the floodgates of our borders, the first folks who flood in will be the big corporations who've been doing business in other states and already can set up shop like that. And once you let them get a foothold in the market, it will be very hard to carve out space for smaller operations in the future. So as much as we would love to put our foot on the gas and get it done all in this session, I think you're right. I think it's very wise for us to take our time and structure that right, or we're just going to replicate the inequity in the economics of those drug markets again, and we'll just enshrine it in the law.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, folks, please keep dropping in chats here or questions in the chat, because we're having a great discussion. And I know you can see that there's an enormous range of things for us to talk about. Some of what we're talking about here is just how effective that you have been inside of the current system that we have in the General Assembly. You're very much a student of the game. I think there's also an appetite from a lot of folks for changing the structures in which we operate for the better. And there's a question here from Ross that is specifically about potentially amending the Virginia Constitution to permit successive terms for a governor so that you could get more done. What do you think about that? And maybe if you were able to lead some serious democracy institutional reform in Richmond during your term as governor, what are the things that you might consider doing to our state constitution to give us a government that works better by design?
That's a great question. On the 2-term governor, I do support that. There was a constitutional amendment in the Senate that died on the Senate floor that I supported. It tends to break down over a fight of how much power is the governor willing to give up to get that second term. But I do think that we should have a 2-term governor. I think the reforms that I would do is anything that makes state government more accessible. We all grew up learning we are a government by, of, and for the people. And yet state government is very inaccessible to a lot of people. I think moving, one of the upsides to COVID and we've made virtual access has allowed more people to participate in our proceedings than ever before, but we can do better. I think anything that we can do to level the playing field as far as campaign finance reform is important. I think more transparency in what we are doing as a state government, and there's so much, whether it's making things more accessible to language minorities or changing the times when we operate. I mean, the whole General Assembly calendar was based around when we were an agrarian society and everybody in the General Assembly was a farmer, and they didn't have a whole lot to do in January and February. But now most people work full-time year-round, and they work from 9 to 5, and they can't come participate in subcommittee meetings at 7 a.m. in Richmond. So anything we can do to make our government more accessible, I'm all for. I haven't really thought much more about specific constitutional amendments that I would introduce, but I think everything that I would focus on is making us more accessible, and then making us reflect, making state government reflect the full diversity of the Commonwealth, which we don't right now. And through my appointments as governor, I would particularly focus on making sure that I'm filling my cabinet, my agencies, boards, and commissions in a way that reflects the full diversity of the Commonwealth.
I think one of the things that we should really be considering in terms of making state government, both more accessible and diverse, is to do more to empower the legislature. I think one of the things that I think a lot of citizens have felt in the last year with COVID is just how powerful the governor is, because only the executive governs year round. And the legislature is really disempowered when we're not in session, and we are the most accessible elected to most people because we're in that community. And so when you have a really part-time warp speed session, then the elected who is most accessible to the constituents is really disempowered. And so thinking about how do we level that balance of power between the legislature and the executive, I think is also a really important part about making it more accessible to people. There's another, you touched on campaign finance, and as we think about power and accessibility and transparency, there's one question that we have a few folks asking about in various different ways, and that is about the power of our utilities, which are one of the biggest political forces in Richmond right now, particularly Dominion Energy. I know both you and I have carried legislation this year to try to reform just how much money Dominion Energy makes in overcharging customers. And both of those bills met the same fate, which was to die speedily in the dead of night in a subcommittee on the Senate side, which had no interest in hearing them. Can you talk to us about what we can do about that? What does it mean to really empower consumers and claw back the scope of that influence in our General Assembly?
Yeah, I think, that influence is based on two parts. One, they're very, energy regulation or electric regulation is complicated. And because we are a part-time legislature, there are very few people in office who fully understand how electric regulation works. And so they are more likely to listen to the experts. And when the State Corporation Commission is reticent to give an opinion, then that leaves the utility. That's the first problem. The second problem is when there are no campaign contribution limits and they're able to make large campaign contributions, that gives the perception, if nothing else, of undue influence. And so there were two bills both last year and this year that I supported. One would have prohibited electric monopolies from giving any campaign contributions. And a second one that would put campaign finance limits on all donors. I think both are important. Now, unfortunately, both of those bills died, but I think we are going to continue to push for campaign finance reform so that no one has undue influence, but particularly electric monopolies, they're guaranteed to recover their costs and earn a profit. They're guaranteed by our state constitution. They're guaranteed that, and yet the laws we pass as a General Assembly directly impacts how they're going to recover their costs and how much profit they can earn. And their customers have no choice. So to me, that's different from any other business. But I do think we need campaign finance limits on everybody, because I think giving any one person or one entity the ability to give large donations just leads to an unlevel playing field for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. There's something very special about a state regulated monopoly. If we set their profits and then they take those profits and pour them back into campaign coffers, you have a pretty clear conflict of interest. And like you said, customers don't have a choice. And so there's no way they can walk away from the very bad deals that are currently being cut on their behalf in Richmond. Senator, as always, this conversation is flying by because you have so much to share. We have about 10 minutes left and have some great questions coming in. Something that we haven't touched on yet that I want to make sure we make some time for is healthcare. We've talked about education. We have talked about criminal justice. We have talked about energy. We haven't yet talked about health, which is something that you've done a lot of great work on as well. It's also something that is very top of mind for people in the Charlottesville community because as of 3 years ago, this place had the highest health insurance premiums in the country, which again was sort of a problem with how we regulate the State Corporation Commission because the Bureau of Insurance was sort of asleep at the wheel and rubber stamped those insurance premiums, which led us to have those sky high costs. You have done really foundational work on our state exchange to set up possibilities for different ways of offering health insurance in the Commonwealth. Can you talk about what you see us doing to build on that framework in the coming years to make healthcare, quality healthcare, really meaningful and affordable to everyone?
Yeah. So what I'm excited about with the exchange is not just the fact that we're finally going to have a state-based exchange, which Patrick Hope and I were pushing for back in 2012. But when we run the exchange, it gives the state the ability to look across different types of insurance to figure out, are people in the right market? Because your eligibility shifts. And this year's been a really good example. As people lose their jobs or as their income levels shift, having one entity who can look across and figure out what's the right path for you, for your insurance options today is tremendous. And so I'm pretty excited about that. And I think at the same time, we have done so much to strengthen our Medicaid program here in Virginia. We still have a long way to go. We still have one of the sort of most stingy Medicaid programs in the country, but we're really pushing to make pregnant women eligible for the first full year after birth and providing a dental benefit as a couple of other things that we're doing. I do want to shift a little bit from insurance, though, to make sure we also need to, because this gets lost in the conversation. We have got to focus on more access to care. We have too many communities where, there are communities in this Commonwealth where there's no OB, there's no labor and delivery hospital in that community. Making sure we are increasing access to affordable quality care, not just insurance, but the actual care. Making sure we are addressing disparities in health outcomes, whether it's infant mortality or maternal mortality. We know those disparities are there. We've done study after study about why they're there, but we haven't implemented the policies that we need to address them. So we also have to make sure that we are doing that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. It is long past time that we stop setting the bar at coverage and we really start talking about delivery of care. Since we are winding down with our time, I know that we have had a wonderful conversation about a lot of good policy. There are a handful of questions in the chat about politics, about the campaign that is heating up, and some folks who would love to ask you about that. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the state of the race and, what does a path to victory look like to you between now and June? It is a wide field with lots of different folks. Why is it that you think that you are the candidate who can really stand out and take this not just through the primary, but over the finish line in November so that we can keep a Democrat in the governor's mansion?
Well, I think, Virginia is ready for the next generation of leadership, but someone who has the experience and the ability to get things done right away. We have seen through COVID, but really, before COVID with the Trump era, how important it is you have someone with experience who knows how to build coalitions, who knows how to bring people, not just bring people to the table, but take the policymaking table out into our communities. It's something I've done as a legislator. It is something I will do as governor. I have a clear perspective and understanding of how we got where we are as a Commonwealth, but my life experiences and perspective as a Black woman, as a mother, as a working mother, just it brings a different lens that we haven't had at the top level of government here. And everyone's political views are shaped by their life experience. Not only are my life experiences different, but I recognize they're not universal. And so I am always willing and able to bring those other perspectives to the table so that we're centering everyone in our policymaking process. And it's, people are ready for someone who can give them hope again. I recognize that we are hurting right now. We are in the midst of 4 crises going on at once: a health pandemic, an economic crisis, a reckoning with 400 years of racial inequity, but also a growing lack of faith in government's ability to understand people's problems, let alone solve them. I will be a governor who can help bring us together and build the coalitions we need to solve the problems we face today. This race is wide open. Depending on the poll you read, over 50% of the primary voters are undecided. I am going to reach every corner of this Commonwealth. I have spent 30 years, first as a young Democrat and party activist, as a community organizer, out in our communities, building networks to help bring people together and get things done. I will do that as governor, just like I have done that as a legislator in the last 15 years. And we're going to have some fun doing it, because I think one of the things we've really lost is a belief that politics is the art of the possible. Politics is not the art of winning. Politics is the art of the possible. And when we all come together, it is very possible for us to solve our problems. We will do that together, and we'll have some fun along the way.
Well, one thing is certain. I think a lot of people all across the country are much more keenly aware of just how much their governor matters, because how governors have been making life or death decisions in the last year has affected very transparent markers of how things are going state by state. We basically get a cross-state report card every day that tells us who's governing well and who's not. How many shots in arms, how many kids in school. We can measure very concretely whether or not government is really working on the problems that matter to people most. And I think we're also very aware just how much power that office has and why it matters to have someone in that seat who's very serious about doing serious work, because it's not just about big ideas. It really is about getting the details right. And I can personally attest that I'm one of the many big Senator McClellan fans all across Virginia who have had the good fortune to work with you on serious policy, and can attest to just how much care and rigor you bring to all of that work. So with the time that we have left, then let me just ask you, how can people help? For folks who are excited about helping you be our nominee in June, what's the best way to help with the campaign right now?
So if you go to my website at jennifermcclellan.com, there are all the different ways you can get involved. We have petition signature events going on, because we still need to get on the ballot. We have coalition groups that we are pulling together to help organize, do relational organizing. We have already started doing voter contact through phone banking, and we will be doing canvassing very safely, text banking. Donations, it is very expensive to run a campaign. So if you're willing to donate, there are many different ways to get involved, but if you go to jennifermcclellan.com, you'll see all the different ways that you can get involved. You can sign up to volunteer. We also have a Facebook page. It's SEN Jennifer McClellan is the main Facebook page, and it'll take you to all the different coalition groups. But this is not a moment about me. This is a movement about the future of Virginia we're going to build together. So please come and join our movement.
Well, let me just say how excited I am to have someone with your talent and passion, not just serving in the Senate, but running for governor. The biggest problem that we have in working with you is that you work on everything. And so whenever anybody needs help, the first question is, oh, well, we should ask Senator McClellan. And then you have to go, well, she's already doing everything. So can we ask somebody else this one time? Because maybe she needs just a little bit more room on her plate. So it's a good problem to have someone like you who we can lean on for so much. So thank you for all that you do, for all that you're taking on in running for governor while serving in office. It really is an honor to serve with you.
Thank you, Sally. It's an honor to serve with you, and just keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for tuning in tonight. We will be back here in this spot at 7:00 next week with another candidate for lieutenant governor. We've got great folks running statewide for all three of those offices. And I thank all of you for tuning in, for taking your role in our democracy seriously. We really can't do it without you. So thank you, Senator. Thanks everybody for watching, and we will see you next week. Good night.